So with that, let's jump into the Nativity story according to tradition. So the story begins, actually, if we're going to tell this story, we begin first with the story of Mary and who Mary is, right? So the Nativity story of tradition doesn't begin with we have this virgin who comes out of nowhere and then is suddenly chosen. The traditions about Mary actually start with the story of Joachim and Anna. So Joachim and Anna are the parents of Mary. And according to tradition, they were barren. They were a couple who was righteous and yet had been incapable of conceiving children. And this was actually a point of shame because keep in mind, throughout the Old Testament, folks tended to look at whether or not a woman's womb was opened or closed as an indication of divine judgment or not. And so the very fact that they had not yet received children seemed to be in some ways an indictment, a point of shame about them. And, according to tradition, they had really sort of looked through the catalogs, right, of who had conceived and so on. And they were in many ways alone in this plight as a barren couple, in Israel. And so what they ended up doing is they ended up doing what all good biblical saints do. They prayed. Joachim goes out into the desert. He takes his flocks and he goes out there and he fasts and he prays. And meanwhile, Anna is alone at home, also praying. And Joachim is visited by the angel Gabriel, same one who visits Mary later on. And the angel Gabriel assures him that his prayer has been heard and that God is going to grant them, Joachim and Anna, a child, right? This very unique child, the child Mary. And then Gabriel also ends up visiting Anna, who, according to tradition, is sitting in her garden, watching, waiting when she's visited by Gabriel. And then when Joachim returns from the wilderness in his time of fasting and prayer, Joachim and Anna meet at the gates, right? And they both know. And this is actually, this is one of the icons of Joachim and Anna, is them embracing at the gates with the common knowledge that they've been visited by the angel Gabriel and that they are going to conceive. And so, sure enough, they do what couples do. And Anna ends up conceiving. And the promise is fulfilled. They conceive the baby, Mary. Now, what happens with this is that also part of this story is something very similar to the story of the prophet Samuel. So you'll recall that the prophet Samuel was a miraculous child, right? Given to a woman who had zealously cried out to God, right? Hannah, his mother. And her womb had been opened by God. And as a result, she devoted Samuel to the temple. And this was a practice. This wasn't as if that's something that only ever happened once. There were oftentimes children and also specifically maidens who had been devoted to the service of the temple by pious parents. And so Joachim and Anna, very much in this tradition, had determined that they would go ahead and devote their child, Mary, to the service of God, to the temple. And so according to tradition, Anna, wishing for Mary to, her first steps to be upon the temple itself, her desiring for her to be fully devoted to God, she ends up, she when she gives birth to Mary, she never lets her feet touch the ground. And she, lays on her bed and only eats holy food while she's pregnant with Mary and all this sort of stuff. You have these pictures of devotion. And they have the intention of devoting Mary to the temple at age 2. But, Anna is really attached. So she pleads with Joachim, can she please just stay with us until age 3? And you'll notice that in the story, the number 3 shows up, a couple of different times if you read through this, and no surprise, right? Holy Trinity, a good biblical number that shows up often. And so Joachim acquiesces, right? Yes, of course, we can hold on to her until she's age 3. And then the time comes and Mary is devoted to God at the temple, and her feet, touch the temple. That's the first thing that they touch, and specifically she set upon the third step. And as her feet touch the third step, this being the first thing that she's ever touched, right? The first part of the ground, so to speak, that her feet have ever touched. She is filled with the grace of God, and she dances before God. And this marks the beginning of her life within the temple. And so according to tradition, Mary grew up within the temple. She's not the only maiden, by the way, that grew up in the temple. As I said, it was not as if, the prophet Samuel was the only child that a pious Jewish parent ever devoted to service of God. And so there were a variety of maidens, within the Jewish temple. Mary was one of them. And so Mary grew up, amongst the maidens of the temple. She was, according to tradition, fed by angels. She was actually recognized in her sort of uniqueness to be allowed, as she was permitted to enter into the Holy of Holies. And there came a point where obviously the maidens needed to be ushered out of the temple. Why? Well, because at some point they're going to start bleeding, right? And for that reason, under Old Testament Jewish ceremonial law, they would be considered unclean. And so they can't continue to occupy the temple. And so at some point, you've got to do something with these maidens. You got to betroth them or something to sort of usher them out. And so Mary, the time has come for Mary to be, handed off. Now, the problem is during the years, right, of her childhood, between the time of age 3 when she was dropped off there and the time when she was sort of released and ultimately betrothed to Joseph, she had been orphaned, right? So she didn't have parents. So the question was, what do we do with her? And the priest Zacharias ends up going into the Holy of Holies to inquire of God, what do I do? What do I do with this maiden? And so while in there, he's visited by the angel Gabriel. And the angel Gabriel instructs him that what he's supposed to do is he's supposed to gather the widowers of Israel. And then they'll be given a sign of who she's supposed to be betrothed to. So they end up doing exactly that, right? They gather these widowers. Joseph is amongst them. Now this goes to a feature of the story that, again, is sort of disrupts what a lot of people presume. A lot of people presume that Joseph and Mary must have just been some, happy-go-lucky couple that, saw each other in the market and fell in love and wanted to get married and things like that. That's not how the story goes. In fact, Joseph is considered to be rather, up there, right? He's a middle-aged man. He's a widow. He has been widowed, and he is, and he has kids, right? He has kids from his first wife, one of whom is James, as in the brother of the Lord, is actually Jesus' stepbrother. It's Joseph's, child from the prior marriage. So Joseph is amongst the various widowers who are brought out there, and a dove flies down and lands on the staff of Joseph, and they're like, "Okay, you're the guy." He's like, "The guy for what?" And the answer is the guy to, marry this little girl, Mary. And in the story, Joseph is scandalized. Joseph, quite literally, if you look at the Gospel of James account, he looks at this and he's like, "She's a kid. I'm going to be the laughing stock of Israel. I'm like an old man. I've got kids. And you want me to marry some child? Are you out of your mind?" And the priests are like, "Look, when an archangel shows up and tells you to give her to whoever we tell you to give her to, that's what you do. So you're stuck with her." And that's where you have Mary betrothed to Joseph, who is a righteous man. Now we're going to come back to this, but one of the questions is well, why? What's going on here? And we'll come back to this, but part of the story is that the devil was aware of the prophecy about a virgin who's going to conceive. And for that reason, the devil is watching the maidens of Israel. The devil is watching to see what's going to befall these virgins and which one is going to conceive the Christ child. So by betrothing her to a man, they end up providing cover from the watchful gaze of the devil. And that is an important part of the story. But at the same time, you need to betroth her to someone who's not going to touch her. And that's the importance of the widower, right? Somebody who is older, who is really just an older caretaker for her, not a true husband. Again, we'll come back to that sort of thing. So Joseph, in keeping with this commission, ends up taking Mary into his home. And she ends up staying there, leaving the temple, staying there. They're betrothed to be married, but Joseph is not present, right? He has business elsewhere. And he goes off for a long period of time. And while he's gone, Mary is visited by somebody. You probably know this part of the story. She's visited once again by the angel Gabriel, who shows up yet again in the story. And here we get the Annunciation, where the angel Gabriel announces to her that she's going to conceive and bear a child. She asks, how? And he says, that, it's going to be from God, right? She's going to conceive by the Holy Spirit. His power is going to overshadow you, and you shall bear the Son of God. And so, and let it be done unto me, right? So Mary, concedes, she accepts this. And then after Joseph's travels, as he comes back, he ends up coming back to find a girl who is pregnant. And he is scandalized once again in the story. Joseph is scandalized because he looks at this. He's like, what have you been doing? My world's being turned upside down. I'm already dealing with the fact that I've been widowed over here. Then I just gather at the temple because I've been called there. And before you know it, I'm betrothed to a child. I head off for business. I come back. You're pregnant. What have you been doing? And I know, obviously, I'm being hyperbolic about that. But this is an important part of tradition, that Joseph is really sort of dealing with this and struggling with this in important ways. If you look at the nativity icon in Eastern Orthodoxy, Joseph is always down in the lower corner, like, struggling. And there's an old man who's talking to him. And the old man is the devil, because he's whispering to him. Are you sure? Right? Is that really is that your kid? Is that not your kid? Right. And so Joseph, having to deal with the sort of doubt and questioning that he faces, is an important part of the story. And obviously that shows up in the Gospels as well. Because as we know in the Gospels, he's a righteous man. And he doesn't want to expose her to public shame or scandal. So he's like, I'm just going to write a certificate of divorce. We're going to do this sort of thing, put her away quietly, and we'll be done with it. And he's visited in a dream. And he's told in the dream, right, that nope, what she has conceived is from God. She's telling you the truth, right? That's the real story. And so, do not divorce her or put her away, right? You've been chosen for this sort of thing. And so that's an important part of the story. Now, there is another part of the story, again, that goes to the scandal of this. So there is a tradition. Part of tradition is that there came a scribe who came and visited Joseph and saw the pregnant Mary and realized they had not yet actually been united in marriage. And so he ends up reporting them to the temple, that these two have been engaged in fornication, right? That she's pregnant by him and they haven't been married yet. And so they end up pulling Joseph and Mary into the temple. And based on the description in the Gospel of James, it seems that the procedure is very much what you see in Leviticus, where there's some sort of examination of them. There is some sort of concoction worked up that they're supposed to drink, and whether or not they negatively react is what's supposed to tell you whether or not they're telling the truth, whether they're innocent or guilty. It's supposed to expose them, so to speak. If you're not familiar with this, you can look it up in Leviticus. But fact of the matter is that both drink, neither of them is affected. And so the priest basically says, look, if God has chosen not to, expose your guilt and shame, then who am I to do that? And so despite his sort of skepticism over this whole thing, he just kind of lets them be. And so, they go on their way. And then we get the census, right? So this is one of the other well-known moments within the story, where every person is called. There's a census throughout Rome, and every person is called to their hometown. in order to be registered. And so Joseph, he brings James and he brings Mary. And one of the conundrums that he's faced with during this time is the question of, what do I do with this girl? And just to give you a sense of like the age difference, how not romantic this relationship is, what Joseph queries over is whether or not he should register her as his daughter or as his wife. Again, he recognizes like people are going to be like, wait, that's your wife? So Joseph is perpetually walking around with this scandal, right, of this massive age difference between him and this pregnant girl, right, this pregnant teenager that he's bringing with him. Anyway, they go on and we know this part of the story as well, right? There's no room for them in the inn. And so they end up having to lodge in a manger. Now, the manger, one of the things that happens a lot within early Christian tradition is that there's a tremendous amount of typology, right? These sort of types, these early pictures, like vague pictures of things that are to come, of various symbols and things like that. And one of the things that comes up within the story is that the manger itself, we oftentimes lose this because of contemporary Western iconography. Most folks think of the manger as a barn, right? But if you look at the old, Byzantine, Eastern iconography, what you see is that the manger is a cave, right? It's this cave in the side of the mountain. Now, more importantly, that cave looks identical to the mouth or the cave that represents Hades at the resurrection of Christ. And so throughout tradition, Christ being wrapped in swaddling cloths and laid in a manger was always understood to be a foreshadowing of his future death and burial. The entire idea that he's wrapped in burial garments and then laid within this cave, right? That's something that's lost because of the way we conceive of the iconography. But that's what you start to anticipate. That's what you see within this imagery, and that's what's preserved within the iconography. So we should maybe I can have my producer throw up here the Nativity icon so that you can see, right? You can see here in this icon the mouth of the cave, the burial garments of Christ, which if you compare that with something like the raising of Lazarus, the burial garments are identical to the swaddling cloths of the baby Jesus. And you can also see the devil, right, testing Joseph, going like, really, is this from God? Is she a floozy? Like, what's really going on? What do you know? What do you know? What do you really know about what's going on here? So anyway, so that's part of the imagery there. Now, what's also important here is you also see within this tradition the insistence on Mary being ever virgin. Now, this is another sort of doctrine that is shocking to so many Protestants who, again, are only familiar with the gospel accounts. And so they only have these sort of fragmented pieces of the story. And so, like, for example, the age difference between Joseph and Mary, they're unfamiliar with, that James is from a prior wife, they're unfamiliar with, those sorts of things. And so they'll bump into certain things in the gospel accounts that seem to be, when they first hear about this ever virgin doctrine, the idea that Joseph and Mary never had sex, that Mary remained a virgin for her entire life, they're shocked and they're scandalized because they're like, well, wait a second. Jesus had brothers, right? Wait a second. They didn't come together until she gave birth. Jesus is referred to as her firstborn son in the Gospels, and they'll sort of rattle off some of these things. Now, I don't want to make this an episode about, Mary's perpetual virginity. So I'm not going to go through the details, of what is sort of problematic about that case, right? That sort of argues against her perpetual virginity. I actually go through that doctrine and the defense of it, the defense of her perpetual virginity in that Substack post. So if you're really interested in that, you can go to there. Suffice it to say that much of it has to do with the difference between Greek and English. The term translated until, they didn't come together until, in Greek can mean up to that point and beyond. It doesn't indicate It doesn't require that it means up to that point and no further. Firstborn, obviously, in Jewish culture has to do with the one who is the recipient of the inheritance. So firstborn does not, in that context, indicate, it doesn't require a secondborn. You can be the firstborn and the onlyborn of somebody within Jewish tradition. And then also in terms of, adelphoi, whether you're talking about the masculine adelphos or the feminine adelphi, you're talking about a term that really just indicates relatives. Lot, for example, is Abraham's nephew, but in the Septuagint is referred to as his adelphos. So this just tells us that Jesus has relatives, and we look at, certain things like tradition about James, stepbrother, or we look to the Jewish historian Hegesippus, who talks about like James and Josie, the children of Mary, the wife of Clopas. We start to realize, oh, that's Jesus's cousins, and so we actually do have an accounting of who these people are. And so all that's to say is that I understand how reading the gospel accounts without tradition and things like that, and without sort of the more sort of wider terminology of Greek, it might look like Jesus has siblings born of Joseph via Mary, but the case from tradition that is not true is actually quite sound. So anyway, you can go and see those details. The reason I bring that up here is because within the gospel account that comes up, right? That comes up specifically with regard to the miraculous birth of Christ. So Irenaeus is somebody who talks about this. Irenaeus is an early church father who is the disciple of Polycarp, who is the disciple of John, the Apostle John, whom Jesus loved, and who was the caretaker of Mary, entrusted Christ on the cross, entrusted the Virgin Mary to John to take care of her. So John discipled Polycarp, and Polycarp discipled Irenaeus. And Irenaeus talks about this fact that the Virgin Mary had a miraculous birth, right? He talks about the way in which the contrast basically between the sort of post-fall birthing experience of women who are under the curse of the fall versus the sort of very supernatural birthing experience of Mary. And you see this come through in the gospel account. So the Gospel of James account, not the gospel accounts, the Gospel of James account, where according to tradition, again, within the story, when it comes time for Mary to give birth, there is a midwife there. But the glory of the Lord, sort of descends and fills the manger, obscuring her, right? So much like in the ways in which throughout the Old Testament, right, one like the Son of Man would appear, but he would be enveloped in the glory of God in this cloud or something like that, where he'd be obscured. So in the same way, that happens at the birth of Christ. And so the midwife doesn't really get to participate, or help in the birthing of this child. And when the glory sort of dissipates, what she ends up finding is Mary with this miraculous child. And so she's blown away, right? The midwife is shocked. Like, this is clearly something miraculous has happened here. So the midwife runs out in her enthusiasm, and she goes and she tells, her friend Salome about this woman and this miraculous birth and this child. And Salome is like, what are you talking about? I'm not going to believe this unless I actually go and check this girl myself. Yes, graphically, I know that sounds graphic. That is actually what she's talking about. Like, I want to see if she's really a virgin, because I'm not buying this whole like virgin conception thing. But that actually is what Salome ends up saying. And here you can see, again, just like other parallels between these events and later things. She is a foreshadowing of St. Thomas, right? Who's like, unless I can put my hand into Christ's side, I'm not going to believe that, he's been raised from the dead. And so in the same way, Salome goes to the manger and is like, I'm going to check this girl. And she does, and she's shocked, and she repents of her unbelief, believes in the virgin conception and birth, and gives glory to God. And she goes away justified. That's the way, if I'm remembering correct, the Gospel of James puts it, right? She goes away justified because of her faith in this event and her repentance over her unbelief. So now we get to the other parts of the story that we're very familiar with, right? We have Magi, right? These wise men, as they are called Magi in the text. These wise men who are from the east, who end up coming because they've followed a star because, these watchers of the stars have determined that there is some sort of king that has been born. And I know a lot of folks are kind of like, well, who are these wise men and so on? Magi is not an ambiguous term. If we look at Diogenes Laertius, his Life of the Philosophers, Magi is a specific sect that he describes in there. So anyway, they are largely like monotheistic mystics, philosophical mystics, who are seeking to hear the voice of God and obey the logos and all this sort of stuff. And so these folks who are also watchers of the stars end up finding a star that leads them to Bethlehem. Now, what's interesting is, according to the church fathers, what you see is in several different places, Chrysostom and others, the star is actually identified not as a natural occurrence, right? Not as a star, but as an angel. And so this angel, according to tradition, the star, which incidentally, in Jewish tradition, the creation of the angels was associated with the creation of the stars in the Genesis account. So it's not like the talk of associating angels and stars and some things like that was not sort of completely without precedent within Jewish tradition. But anyway, so they follow this star to Bethlehem, right? Like that's where it leads them, right, to this child. And in their journey, of course, they end up consulting with Herod, right, King Herod. And so Herod is deeply concerned about, this talk of a king that has been born. And so he tries to engage in this bit of a ruse where he's like, okay, yeah, kings foretold, right? Stars telling of them. Okay, yeah. Sure, yeah, you should go find that guy. And then come and tell me where he is so I can come and pay homage and worship him. And of course, we know that what Herod wanted to do is to kill him, right? And so then when the Magi are warned, don't go back and tell Herod, Herod ends up taking a different tactic, which is say, well, let's go ahead, where is this child supposed to be according to the prophecies, and what age should we approximate here? Any kids under 2? Okay, let's just kill them all and hope that we get them, in the process. And this is where this is an event that's commemorated, right? The Holy Innocents within the Orthodox tradition. They're all deemed to be, in Orthodox tradition, all those infants are considered martyrs, and you can see icons of the Holy Innocents, right? These infant martyrs who were, the first of the martyrs for Christ. But anyway, you have that tactic by Herod, and obviously Joseph is warned in a dream again to flee, take the child and his mother, and get to Egypt. And so that's where they flee to until Herod dies, and then they're free to bring the child back. Oh, and of course, I neglected to mention here, we do have the temple incident, right? Where when the time of purification was passed in terms of Mary, and it was time for the child to be circumcised, they end up bringing Jesus to the temple. And of course, this is where Symeon recognizes, he hears the child, he recognizes him as the Christ. He's been assured that he will not depart the flesh before his eyes behold the Messiah. And here it is, right? He recognizes Jesus as the Christ. And then he says, he offers his declaration that, every Vespers, the Orthodox still say during Vespers, let me, where his prayer, about let your servant now depart in peace, for my eyes has seen thy salvation, the glory of thy people Israel, light in the Gentiles and the glory of thy people Israel. He goes through that whole thing. And so you get that sort of moment, right? The recognition of the Christ in there. Hey, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you haven't done so already, please go ahead and follow, subscribe, hit like if that's an option on whatever you're listening to. All that sort of stuff really helps us out here. So I greatly appreciate your support. And until next time, I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast.